Let me ask you a direct question. If God were not watching you, who would you be? If there were no heaven as a reward, nor hell as a threat, nor a divine gaze noting every step you take, what would remain of your goodness, your choices, your fear? This question seems modern. It feels like something from the internet, from current debates. But it was answered with a depth that no one has surpassed to this day, by a man who was born almost 400 years ago, and his answer cost him everything he had. To understand this man, you first need to understand where he came from. Baruch Spinoza's family was not just any family. They were Jews from Portugal, people who spent generations pretending to be Christian to avoid being burned alive. His grandfather and father knew a world where praying the wrong prayer, in the wrong language, in front of the wrong person, ended in a public burning. The Inquisition watched neighbors, tortured suspects, turned faith into theater and survival. When this family finally escaped to Amsterdam, the freest city in Europe, they could, for the first time in over a century, practice Judaism in broad daylight. Now imagine what it meant for this community of survivors, for the brightest son of one of their families to rise up and say, "None of this came from God," because that's what happened. The boy whom the teachers pointed out as a rare gem of the synagogue school, the heir to the prosperous Spinoza trade, grew up and began to ask questions that had no safe answers. If God is perfect and infinite, why would he have vanity, jealousy, and wrath as described in the scriptures? If God is infinite, what exists outside of him? And if nothing exists outside of him? Then the world was not created by God. The world exists in God. The mountains, the seas, the stars, your thoughts right now, all of this would not be the work of a distant creator, but a direct expression of a single infinite reality, which Spinoza called, with the most scandalous formula of his century, God or nature. Notice the size of the heresy. He did not say that God does not exist. That would be mere atheism, and Europe knew how to punish atheists. He said something worse, that God exists but is not that God. He has no throne, no face, no chosen people, did not write any book, made no covenant with anyone. That Moses, the prophets, and the priests spoke as men of their time, and that obeying them out of fear of eternal punishment is not religion. It is the slavery of the mind. A community that bled for its faith at the hands of the Inquisition heard this from its own son. The answer came in 1656, and it was a thunderclap, the most severe excommunication ever pronounced in that synagogue. Solemn curses, absolute isolation, erasure of the name. He was 23 years old. He walked out the door and never returned. He even changed his name from Baruch, blessed in Hebrew, to Benedictus, the same word in Latin. Blessed in the same way, the silent gesture said, only now without asking anyone's blessing. What followed was a life that seems invented, the near-stabbing murder, the anonymous book that all of Europe called Forged in Hell, the refusal of a university chair to owe obedience to any prince, the voluntary poverty in a rented room, the lenses polished by hand to pay for bread, and the glass dust entering his lungs year after year like a death clock, until the end, at 44, with the work of his life hidden in a desk, waiting for a world that did not yet exist. That world arrived. Slowly, but it arrived. Today, Spinoza is studied as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Einstein declared he believed in his God, and the question he left remains open, pointed at each of us like a perfectly polished lens. What if you were never created, because you were never separate? In the next few minutes you will follow this story from beginning to end. The childhood among survivors of the Inquisition, the rupture, the curse, the persecution, and the strange serenity of a man who lost everything and complained about nothing. This is the uncomfortable truth about the God who did not create you, and it begins in an Amsterdam of canals and ships, where a boy learned Hebrew in the morning, and heard at night from the elders stories of bonfires. Amsterdam, 1630s. If you walked through the streets of the Vluyenburg neighborhood at that time, you would hear something rare in Europe, the sound of Hebrew being taught to children in broad daylight, without fear, without locked doors, without whispered passwords. For anywhere else on the continent, that would be unthinkable, but Amsterdam was different. Amsterdam was the city where money spoke louder than dogma, where ships arrived loaded with spices, fabrics, and ideas, and where, for the first time in centuries, Jews could be Jews. It was in this world that, on November 24, 1632, a boy named Baruch Spinoza was born. The name in Hebrew means blessed, and at that moment, no one could imagine the irony that this name would carry. Baruch's family belonged to the so-called Portuguese nation, the community of Sephardic Jews who had fled from Portugal and Spain. And it is impossible to understand Spinoza without understanding what this people carried in their memory. They were descendants of families forced into conversion by the power of Catholic kings. For generations, they lived as new Christians, baptized on the outside, Jews on the inside. They lit Shabbat candles in basements. They prayed from memory, because possessing a book in Hebrew was a death sentence. They taught their children, in whispers, who they really were, knowing that a wrong word from a child on the street could lead the entire family to the Inquisition's dungeons. Baruch's father, Miguel de Espinosa, was a respected merchant, importer of dried fruits, olive oil, and other Mediterranean products. A serious man, an active member of the synagogue, who held important positions in the community's administration. The Espinosa house was near the canal, in a neighborhood where Portuguese was spoken in the streets, Spanish in business, and Hebrew in prayers. Little Baruch grew up between three worlds, the Calvinist Holland outside, the Jewish tradition at home, and the Iberian memory hovering over everything, made of longing and scars. He studied at the community school, the Talmud Torah, considered one of the best Jewish schools in all of Europe. And soon the teachers noticed that boy was not like the others. Baruch learned with a facility that impressed. He memorized the texts, yes, but did more than memorize. He connected, he compared. He found tensions between one passage and another. The masters saw in him a brilliant future. Some, it is said, dreamed that he would become a rabbi, one of the great minds of the generation. Among these masters were notable figures: Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, a severe scholar, guardian of orthodoxy, who grew fond of the boy's talent, and Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, a man of a more open mind, who corresponded with Christian intellectuals and who, years later, would negotiate with the English government the readmission of Jews to England. Between the rigidity of one and the curiosity of the other, young Baruch absorbed everything. But life did not give him a gentle childhood. Death hovered over the Espinosa house from an early age. Baruch was only 6 years old when he lost his mother, Hannah Deborah, probably to tuberculosis, the same respiratory disease that decades later, in a fate almost cruel in its symmetry, would also take him. Then came other losses: a stepmother, siblings, and finally, when Baruch was 21, his own father. Death was not, for him, a theological abstraction. It was a domestic presence, repeated, silent. And here it is worth pausing for a moment, because it is easy to imagine great philosophers as marble statues, born ready, thinking eternal ideas in an abstract world. Not Spinoza. Spinoza was a boy who buried his mother at 6 years old, a teenager who heard from the elders stories of uncles and cousins, burned at the stake in Lisbon and Madrid, a young man who had to abandon advanced studies to take over, with his brother, the family business, the debts, the ships that did not arrive, the creditors knocking at the door. The firm Bento y Gabriel de Spinoza faced a brutal market, shaken by wars and piracy. The future rabbi became a merchant. And it was amid the spreadsheets and the warehouses at the port that his mind began slowly to turn to the questions that would change everything. Because there was something that did not add up. The community surrounding him had suffered the unspeakable in the name of faith. And yet when Baruch looked at the sacred texts with the trained eyes that the rabbis themselves had given him, he saw contradictions. He saw a God described with jealousy, regrets, and explosions of wrath, emotions too human for a being that should be perfect and infinite. He saw books attributed to Moses that narrated Moses' own death. He saw promises, threats, rewards, the language of power, not eternity. At first, they were just questions, asked in a low voice, first to himself, then to one or two trusted colleagues. But questions, in a community built on the survival of faith, are sparks in a powder keg. And the powder in Amsterdam was drier than anyone imagined. To understand what happened next, you need to understand one thing about the Jewish community in Amsterdam. It lived in fear, not of the Inquisition's fire. That had been left behind, on the other side of the Pyrenees. The fear now was different, the fear of losing the right to exist. The freedom that Jews had in Holland was real, but it was also conditional. The Calvinist authorities tolerated the community under a tacit agreement. Take care of your own, maintain order, do not scandalize, do not provoke religious debates that disturb Christian peace. Any scandal coming from within the community could jeopardize everything. That is why the leaders of the Portuguese nation policed their members rigorously. Internal heresy was not just a theological problem, it was a political risk, a threat to everyone's survival. And it was not unfounded paranoia. A few years earlier, the community had already gone through a trauma that left deep scars. The case of Uriel da Costa. Uriel was a new Christian from Portugal who fled to Amsterdam, dreaming of the pure Judaism of his ancestors, and upon arrival was disappointed with what he found. He began to criticize the rabbis, to question the immortality of the soul, to say that the laws were human inventions. He was excommunicated, humiliated, readmitted, excommunicated again. In the final readmission, he was subjected to a devastating ritual, public whippings in the synagogue, and the obligation to lie down on the threshold so that all members of the congregation would walk over his body. Shortly after, Uriel da Costa wrote a bitter account of his own life and shot himself. Baruch Spinoza was 7 years old when this happened. He grew up in the shadow of this story, and decades later, fate would place before him a frighteningly similar choice. Because Baruch's questions kept growing. After his father's death, something in him loosened. He began to attend circles outside the community, free-thinking merchants, dissident Christians, people discussing new ideas from France and England. And he took a decisive step. He enrolled in the school of a man named Franciscus van den Enden, a former Jesuit expelled from the order, a physician, a brilliant Latinist, and, according to many, a dangerous radical who hid revolutionary ideas under the guise of teaching classical languages. With van den Enden, Spinoza learned Latin, the key that opened the entire library of European thought. And through that door came a name that would change his life, René Descartes, the Frenchman who dared to say that knowledge should begin with doubt, that nothing should be accepted by authority, tradition, or custom, only by the clarity of reason. For the young dried fruit merchant who spent his nights reading, that was like lighting a lamp in a room that had always been dark. But Spinoza did what he would do his entire life. He did not stop where the master stopped. Descartes, prudent, had separated the world into two, matter on one side, spirit on the other, and carefully left God out of reach of criticism. Spinoza looked at this architecture and saw in it an intellectual cowardice. If reason is valuable, it is valuable for everything, including God, especially God. Meanwhile, in the synagogue, the comments began. Why was Baruch appearing less and less? Why was he associating with heretics and ex-Jesuits? What were those conversations he had with young students, in which it was said he hinted that the law might not be divine, that the soul might not be immortal, that God might have a body, or that he might be the world itself? Two men from the community, pretending to have sincere doubts, approached him to probe him. They asked questions, and Baruch, perhaps naive, perhaps already fearless, answered too frankly. The two ran to the leaders of the synagogue with the report. Miguel de Espinosa's son was a heretic, and now a pause. Because this story is about to reach the moment that changed everything, and I want to know what you would do in his place. Imagine you are 23 years old. On one side, your family, your heritage, your people, everything you have known since childhood. On the other, a single thing: the right to think what your reason has concluded. The community leaders, the reports say, even offered Spinoza a generous annual pension just so he would remain silent and show up at the synagogue from time to time. Money for silence, comfort for obedience. Write in the comments, would you have accepted the deal? Comfortable silence or truth with everything to lose? Be honest, because this question is the heart of this story, and its answer says a lot about each of us. And if you have made it this far, following every step of this young man toward the abyss, it is because you are not just any spectator. You are the kind who wants to understand the ideas that shaped the world, the ones no one had the courage to tell properly. So subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this, told to the core, are exactly what we do here, and what comes next on this journey. You won't want to miss. Now back to Amsterdam, because Spinoza gave his answer to the offer, and it was no. The summer of 1656 arrived in Amsterdam carrying a tension that could no longer be contained. Baruch's private conversations had turned into public rumor. The rumor had turned into scandal. And the scandal for the leaders of the Portuguese nation had become a threat that needed to be eliminated. It is important to say, the leaders tried to avoid the worst. There were conversations, warnings, attempts at reconciliation. The old Rabbi Mortera, who once saw in that young man a wise future for Israel, would have personally tried to bring him back to the path. There are reports of tense meetings, appeals to the memory of his father, to the honor of the family, to the suffering of the ancestors who died, so that this community could exist. And there is the episode of the pension, the offer of money in exchange for external conformity, even if it was feigned. Spinoza's response to all this reveals the man he was becoming. He did not shout. He did not make fiery speeches. He did not preach in the streets against the synagogue. He simply refused to pretend. He would not accept money to represent a faith that his reason had examined and no longer upheld. And he would not ask for forgiveness for conclusions he had reached honestly. For the community, this was incomprehensible. They knew how to welcome repentant heretics. They knew how to punish and forgive sinners. But a calm, educated man, who hated no one and still did not back down an inch, that had no manual, that was more dangerous than any angry blasphemer, because his serenity suggested something intolerable. That perhaps he was not possessed by the devil, nor corrupted by vice. That perhaps he simply believed what he said. On July 27, 1656, the decision was made. Before the sacred ark of the Casa de Jacob synagogue, the document of Cherem against Baruch de Spinoza was read aloud in Portuguese, the language of the community. And here is a detail that historians still point out today with astonishment. The Amsterdam community issued dozens of excommunications throughout that century, almost all temporary, bureaucratic, revocable, punishments for gambling, for disrespect, for commercial disputes. Spinoza's was different from all of them. The chosen text was the most violent in the available repertoire, and it did not establish a deadline, nor a condition for return, nor a door left ajar. With the judgment of the angels and the sentence of the saints, the document said, "We excommunicate, expel, curse, and execrate Baruch de Spinoza. Let him be cursed by day and cursed by night, cursed when lying down and cursed when rising, cursed when going out and cursed when coming in. May the Lord never forgive him. May his wrath and zeal burn against that man." And then the practical orders, cold as blades. Let no one speak to him, not even in writing. Let no one render him any favor. Let no one remain with him under the same roof. Let no one approach him. Let no one read anything composed or written by him. Total erasure. At 23 years old, Baruch de Spinoza ceased to exist for everyone who had known him since birth. Neighbors who had seen him grow would cross the street to avoid him. Business partners would break contracts. Childhood friends would look away. And the family, what was left of it, would treat him as dead. His own sister Rebecca tried to exclude him from the paternal inheritance, and here a small episode occurred, but one that illuminates the character of the man like a lightning bolt illuminates the night. Spinoza went to the Dutch court, fought for the inheritance, and won. And then, having proven his right, he gave up almost everything. He was left, the reports say, with little more than a bed. It was not the money he wanted. It was to make it clear that no one, neither the synagogue nor the family, would decide for him what was rightfully his. How did he react to the curse itself? There is no record of tears nor of fury. Tradition holds that upon learning of the content of the cherem, he said something like, "Very well. This does not obligate me to anything I had not already decided to do on my own." And there is a phrase attributed to him from that time that may be the key to all his future life. The path he chose, he said, he would follow even knowing it was narrow, because he had found something that others could neither give him nor take away. In the following years, he would even leave behind his name. Baruch, blessed in Hebrew, became Benedictus, blessed in Latin, Bento de Spinoza. The same meaning, another language, another world. As if to say, you can expel me from the community but not from the universe. The blessing that matters, no signature on any document can revoke. He was 23 years old, with no family, no community, no defined profession, and a decree of eternal curse over his head. By the calculation of any sensible person of the time, his story ended there. Another Uriel da Costa on the way to a tragic and forgotten end. What no one knew is that it was just beginning. Expelled from the world in which he was born, Spinoza did something that bewildered everyone. He did not beg to return, did not convert to Christianity, as so many excommunicated before him did, and did not destroy himself. Instead, with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural, he began to build, piece by piece, an entirely new life. A life designed for a single purpose, to think about freedom. First, survival. And here comes one of the most fascinating aspects of his biography. Spinoza chose a trade. He became a lens polisher. With his own hands, he carved and polished glass discs for glasses, microscopes, and telescopes. And he was not just any craftsman. Over time, he became one of the best in Holland. Important scientists of the time, including Christian Huygens, one of the greatest physicists of the century, knew and commented on the quality of Spinoza's lenses. Pause for a moment on this image, because it is almost too good to be true. The man who would dedicate his life to teaching humanity to see clearly. Earned his bread by making instruments to see clearly. By day he polished glass to correct the vision of the eyes. By night he polished arguments to correct the vision of the mind. The metaphor was his very life. But this trade had a hidden cost. Polishing lenses fills the air with a fine dust of glass and abrasives. Day after day, year after year, Spinoza breathed this dust in a small room. His lungs, perhaps already weakened by the tuberculosis that plagued his family, were slowly corroded. Each lens that sustained him also killed him a little. He probably knew, and he pressed on, because that work gave him the only thing he demanded from life, independence. And this independence was taken to extremes that astonished his contemporaries. Spinoza reduced his needs to the absolute minimum. Accounts from those who lived with him describe an almost monastic frugality. Simple soup, porridge, a little beer, entire months spent spending almost nothing. Not for religious asceticism, not to punish the body, but for a lucid calculation. Every florin he did not need was a piece of freedom that no one could buy. When wealthy friends tried to gift him generous sums, he refused or accepted only minimal fractions. When an admirer wanted to make him heir to his fortune, Spinoza convinced him to leave the assets to his legitimate family. He even refused pensions that came with the subtlest shadow of obligation. Meanwhile, his mind was at work. Spinoza left Amsterdam and went to live in quiet villages, first Rijnsburg near Leiden, then Voorburg near The Hague. He rented a room in the homes of simple families, almost always Christian, who invariably ended up enchanted by that silent and gentle tenant. And here, history records one of the most beautiful contrasts in all philosophy. The monstrous heretic, the accursed atheist that Europe would learn to hate, was described by his landlords as the best man they had ever known. He would come down at night to talk with the family by the fire. He would ask about the Sunday sermon. He advised the children to be obedient to their parents and attentive to religion. When the landlady once asked him if he believed she could be saved in her religion, Spinoza replied, "Your religion is good. You do not need to seek another. Live with piety and tranquility, and that is enough." Those who expected a raging destroyer of faith found this, a man who had no interest in tearing from the hearts of the simple a comfort that made them live better. His war was never against the sincere faith of ordinary people. It was against something else, the use of fear in the name of God, superstition organized as an instrument of power. And this distinction, which runs through all his work, is what separates Spinoza from a mere polemicist. He did not want to defeat anyone. He wanted to understand everything. In those rented rooms, surrounded by lenses, books, and letters, Spinoza began to write. First, texts that circulated secretly, hand to hand, among a small circle of loyal friends. Merchants, doctors, scholars who gathered to discuss his ideas as if participating in a secret society. Then, a signed book on Descartes' philosophy, the only one he would publish under his own name in his lifetime, which earned him respect in intellectual circles, and in silence in the drawer grew page by page the work of his life. A book he simply called Ethics, written in Latin, in the strangest format one could imagine. Definitions, axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, like a treatise on geometry. As if to say, I will not preach. I will not seduce. I will not threaten. I will demonstrate. Whoever wants to bring me down, let them point out the error in the proof. His fame grew beneath the surface of Europe like an underground river. Letters arrived from scientists, theologians, curious minds, and intellectual spies. Among his correspondents was Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society of London, the heart of the new science. Everyone wanted to know what the excommunicated Jew from Holland thought, and he responded with patience, precision, and a carefully measured frankness, because he knew perfectly well that each letter could be copied, denounced, used against him. Spinoza had learned the lesson of the synagogue. The world was still not ready to hear everything, but it was about to hear much more than it could bear. Because in 1660s Holland, the tension between freedom and fanaticism grew every day, and Spinoza decided he could no longer remain silent. To understand the bomb that Spinoza was about to drop on Europe, you need to understand the battlefield in which he lived. 17th century Holland was an anomaly, the richest, most tolerant and freest nation on the continent, and, precisely for that reason, a cauldron of tensions about to explode. On one side were the liberal Republicans, led by Grand Pensionary Johann de Witt, the most powerful statesman in the country, defenders of trade, religious tolerance, and a government without a monarch. On the other, the House of Orange Party, allied with the strictest Calvinist preachers, who dreamed of a strong prince in command and an official religion dictating the limits of what could be thought. In churches, fiery pastors thundered against decadence, heretics, freethinkers, and any crisis, a war, an epidemic, a naval defeat, made the crowd lean toward fear. Spinoza observed all this with growing alarm. He saw friends of his being persecuted for publishing ideas. He witnessed a case that deeply marked him. Adrian Courbag, a member of his circle, dared to publish in Dutch, the language of the people, not the Latin of scholars, radical ideas about religion, many of them close to Spinoza's own. He was denounced, tried, convicted, and thrown into a house of correction, where he fell ill and died shortly after, in 1669. The message was clear. Dutch tolerance had limits, and crossing them cost lives. Any prudent person would have remained silent forever. Spinoza did the opposite. He decided it was time to attack the problem at its roots, and feverishly wrote the book that would make him the most hated man in Europe, the Theological-Political treatise. Published in 1670 without an author's name, with a false publisher on the cover, it said Hamburg where it should have said Amsterdam. The treatise was, on the surface, a book about biblical interpretation and political theory. In practice, it was pure dynamite in 500 pages, because in it, for the first time in history with such rigor and courage, someone asked the Holy Scripture the questions that are asked of any human document. Who wrote this? When? For whom? With what intention? Under what circumstances? And Spinoza's answers demolished centuries of certainties. The Torah was not written by Moses, it could not have been, and he demonstrated passage by passage the anachronisms, the seams, the accounts of Moses' own death narrated in a text supposedly written by him. The biblical books were late compilations, assembled by scribes over centuries, full of repetitions, contradictions, and human marks. The prophets were not channels of supernatural divine information. They were men of vivid imagination and high morality, who translated their ethical intuitions into the language and limits of their time. Miracles impossible by definition, because the laws of nature are the very expression of divine power, and a God who violated his own laws would be contradicting himself. Accounts of miracles were records of poorly understood events, narrated by people who did not know the natural causes and saw the hand of God in what they could not explain. And then, the central blow, the phrase that made Europe choke, the divine election of the people of Israel did not mean any metaphysical superiority. All peoples are equal before nature, and God has no favorites, because God does not choose anything. The true divine law, Spinoza said, is not in rituals or ceremonies, but in one single thing that no church can monopolize: justice and charity. To know God is to love one's neighbor and understand nature. Everything else, dogmas, hierarchies, ceremonies, is politics dressed in eternity. But Spinoza did not stop at theology. The second half of the book advanced on power. The state, he argued, does not exist to impose the truth, but to guarantee peace and security. And the freedom to think and say what one thinks is not a threat to the state, it is its true purpose. In a free republic, he wrote, everyone should be able to think what they want and say what they think. Trying to control minds is the mark of tyrants, and it always fails. Men can be forced to speak like slaves, but never to think like slaves. A government that persecutes ideas does not produce faith. It produces hypocrites. The effect of the publication was an earthquake. In a few months, the treatise became the most denounced book on the continent. One critic called it a book forged in hell by the devil himself in partnership with a renegade Jew. Calvinist synods demanded its prohibition. Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Jewish theologians, men who hated each other, united in a common front against the anonymous author, whose identity, of course, everyone soon knew. In 1674, the book was officially banned in Holland, along with Hobbes's Leviathan. The Catholic Church would place it on the index of forbidden books. Selling it became a crime, possessing it a risk, praising it a social sentence. And yet, the book circulated, with false covers, disguised titles, sometimes bound as if it were a medical treatise or a work of history. The treatise crossed borders, hidden in luggage and libraries. All of cultured Europe read it, almost always in secret, almost always swearing publicly that they detested it. There was born a phenomenon that would last a century: Spinozism as an accusation, the word that destroyed reputations. And another quieter thing was born. In closed rooms by candlelight, an entire generation of readers discovered that it was possible to think the unthinkable and survive. Spinoza watched all this from his rented room, now in The Hague. He did not respond to the insults. He did not publish fiery defenses. He recorded in letters to friends a serene sadness in the face of the theologian's fury that only confirmed his thesis about the power of fear over minds. And he returned to work. Because the treatise, as scandalous as it was merely the preparation of the ground. The true revolution, the book that would redefine God, man, and happiness, continued to grow in the drawer. But before he could finish it, history would knock on his door in the most brutal way possible. And for the first and only time in his life, the calmest man in Europe would lose control. The year 1672 entered Dutch history with a name that needs no explanation: Rampiar, the year of disaster. Louis XIV's France invaded Holland with an overwhelming army, allied with England and 2 German principalities. Cities fell one after another. Panic took hold of the country. And the people, terrified, did what terrified crowds have always done. They sought scapegoats. The most radical preachers pointed the finger: Johann de Witt, the Republican leader, the man of tolerance, the protector of free thinkers. The military defeat, they shouted from the pulpits, was God's punishment for a country that tolerated heretics and atheists. The crowd believed. On August 20th, 1672, Johann de Witt went to visit his brother Cornelis, imprisoned in The Hague under forged charges of conspiracy. A crowd surrounded the prison. The local militia, instead of protecting the brothers, opened a path. What happened next was one of the most barbaric scenes in European history. The DeWitt brothers were dragged out, beaten, shot, and stabbed. And then the crowd, in a frenzy of hatred, hung the bodies upside down, mutilated them, and some even tore off pieces to sell or eat. Not in some distant and barbaric kingdom. In The Hague, in the most civilized nation in Europe. A few minutes' walk from the room where Baruch Spinoza lived. And then something happened that no one who knew Spinoza had ever seen. The man who received eternal condemnation without a tear, who survived an assassination attempt without a fuss, who responded to the insults of all Europe with polite silence, that man broke down. According to the account that reached us through contemporaries, Spinoza, upon learning of the massacre, wept convulsively. And overcome by something that his own philosophy would spend his life trying to tame, he prepared a poster where he wrote in large letters, Ultimi Barbarorum, the last of the barbarians, or the extreme of barbarism. His intention was to walk to the site of the lynching and preach the poster before the murderous crowd. It would have been suicide. The same mob would have torn him apart in minutes, the heretic, the atheist, the friend of the DeWitts, and he would have gone. He just didn't because his landlord, the painter Hendrik van der Spik, realized what was happening and locked the door of the house, refusing to let him out until the fury passed. Keep this scene in mind, because it answers an accusation that has haunted Spinoza for centuries, that his philosophy was cold, inhuman, indifferent. The philosopher who taught to understand passions instead of being swept away by them almost died, swept away by a passion, the indignation at injustice. Spinoza was not a man without emotions. He was a man who knew the devastating power of them precisely because he felt them, and who dedicated his life to understanding how to transform them into lucidity instead of letting them turn into barbarism. The poster he did not preach that day is perhaps the perfect summary of his ethics. Feel everything, understand everything, and do not become what you fight against. The year of disaster confirmed his worst diagnoses. Fear had turned ordinary citizens into cannibals. Superstition, manipulated by preachers, had destroyed in one day what reason had taken decades to build. The Republic of Tolerance was dying, and the party of the prince and the pastors was taking power. For Spinoza, the lesson was clear and dark. As long as men are governed by fear, fear of the future, fear of death, fear of divine punishment, there will always be those who turn that fear into power, and no frightened crowd is free, no matter how free it claims to be. The following year, 1673, came the test of fire of his personal coherence. An official letter arrived from Heidelberg, Germany. Elector Palatine Karl Ludwig offered Spinoza, the excommunicated, the accursed, the author of the book Forged in Hell, nothing less than a chair of philosophy at the prestigious University of Heidelberg. A worthy salary, prestige, students, the recognition that would erase the stain of 1656 once and for all, with a single condition, expressed in diplomatic language, that he use his freedom to philosophize without disturbing the publicly established religion. Any other person would have seen redemption there. Spinoza saw a gilded cage. His response, polite and devastating, is one of the great documents in the history of intellectual freedom. He thanked for the honor, and he refused. First, he wrote, because teaching would take up the time he needed to think, and then because he did not know, and here is the phrase, within what exact limits this freedom to philosophize should remain so as not to seem to disturb the established religion. Religious conflicts, he observed, do not arise from zeal for faith, but from men's desire to dominate one another. Therefore, he preferred to continue as he was, a private man, poor, without a position and without a master. It was not philosophy that should adjust to the limits of power. It was he who refused to discover too late where power would draw those limits, a professor with a salary or a free lens polisher. Between security and integrity, Spinoza chose the latter for the second time, as he had chosen at 23, as he would always choose. And he returned to his room, to his lenses, and to the manuscript that was now, finally, nearing completion. Because everything, the excommunication, the knife, the burned books, the DeWitts hung upside down, everything converged to a single question, the greatest of all. if the God of fear does not exist? Wait, what exists? And the answer was ready in the drawer. The time had come to open the drawer. The time had come to look inside the book for which Spinoza lived and to understand once and for all the idea that made empires and churches tremble. Prepare yourself, because in the next few minutes we will go straight to the heart of his thought, and if you follow each step, you will understand why this philosophy has been called the most dangerous ever written. The book is called Ethics Demonstrated in the Manner of Geometers, and the title already announces the scandalous method. Spinoza writes about God, the mind, and human happiness as Euclid wrote about triangles. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations closed with the initials QED, as was to be demonstrated. No appeal to authority, no citation of scripture, no threats, no promises, just reason step by step, inviting the reader. If you accepted the previous step, you must accept the next. It is a logical trap of 500 pages, and the prey is everything you thought you knew about God. Let us begin where he begins, with the most fundamental question that exists. What is needed for something to exist by itself, without depending on anything? Spinoza calls this substance that which exists in itself and is conceived by itself, which does not need anything else to be or to be understood. Think carefully. A chair depends on wood, the wood on the tree on the soil and the sun on the laws of physics. Everything we know depends on something else. Go up that chain. What is at the end of it, or rather, at the foundation of everything? And here comes the first demolition. Spinoza demonstrates step by step that such a substance to exist by itself must be infinite, because if it were limited, something would limit it, and then it would depend on that something, and it would not be substance. And if it is infinite, there cannot be two. Think, if there were two infinite substances, where would one end for the other to begin? One would limit the other, and neither would be infinite. Inevitable conclusion. There is one and only one, absolutely infinite substance, eternal cause of itself. And this unique substance, which contains in itself everything that exists, Spinoza calls by the name it has always had, God. Up to this point, a theologian might even applaud. But now comes the step that changes everything. If God is infinite, Spinoza asks, what exists outside of him? Think calmly, because this is the question from which no theology has ever escaped. If something exists outside of God, then God has a limit. He ends where that thing begins, and is not infinite. Therefore, nothing exists outside of God. Nothing. Neither the world, nor matter, nor you. And if nothing exists outside of God, then the world was not created by God, as a carpenter makes a table, separate from him, looking at it from the outside. The world exists in God. It is God in his infinite activity. And then Spinoza writes the formula for which he would be cursed and immortalized. Deus sive natura. God, or rather, nature. Two words for the same and only infinite reality. Understand well what this means and what it does not mean. Spinoza is not saying that God is the trees and the stones, as in a primitive religion. He distinguishes between nature naturans, the infinite, active, generative power, the eternal laws of everything, and nature naturata, the set of produced things, galaxies, oceans, bodies, thoughts. Everything that exists is a mode, a way of being, a modification, an expression of this unique substance. You, at this very moment hearing these words, are a mode of God, not a creature made by him and placed outside, a wave in the infinite ocean, made of the same water, moved by the same laws, inseparable from the whole. And now the consequences fall like dominoes one by one, and each one is a world collapsing. If God is the infinite substance acting through eternal and necessary laws, then God does not have a will like that of a king. He does not deliberate, does not hesitate, does not change his mind. Everything that follows from the divine nature follows with the same necessity with which it follows, from the nature of the triangle, that its angles sum to 180 degrees. God does not make plans. The idea that the universe exists for something, that everything has a hidden purpose, is, Spinoza says, the great human prejudice. We project onto the cosmos our way of acting because we act with goals and imagine that everything must act this way. God does not judge, does not punish, does not reward, attributing to him anger. Jealousy or mercy is to make him a giant man in the sky, and Spinoza writes with dry irony that if triangles had a God, he would be triangular. God does not listen to prayers, not because he is deaf or cruel, but because he is not a person on the other side of the counter, fulfilling requests. Asking God to change the course of things is asking reality to violate its own laws, for 2 + 2 by special favor to equal 5. And then, the final demolition, the one that hurts the deepest. God did not create you. There was no moment when a divine will decided that you would exist, shaped you with care, and placed you in the world with a mission. You are not a special project. You are a necessary expression of the infinite nature, like every star, every insect, every thought. And it is here that 99% of people close the book in anger, feeling that Spinoza has robbed them of something precious, but those who continue discover what he offers in its place. Because notice what just happened. If you were not created by God, it is because you were never separated from God. Creation requires distance, the creator here, the creature there. Spinoza eliminates the distance. You are not a work of God, you are part of God, of the eternal substance, of the infinite laws, of the only reality that exists. What religions promised as a future reward for a few, union with the divine, Spinoza demonstrates as a present and universal fact. It does not need to be earned. It is impossible to lose. It always was. The God of fear dies in these pages, it is true, but notice what dies with him. Hell, cosmic guilt, original sin, eternal vigilance, the dread of divine wrath. And notice what is born, an entire, infinite, and logical universe, of which you are a direct expression, without intermediaries, without customs, without a doorman between you and the absolute. This, however, opens up an immense problem, and Spinoza knew it. If everything follows from necessary laws, where does human freedom fit? If God does not judge, why be good? If there is no heaven or hell, what remains of morality, of meaning, of hope? Europe shouted these questions against him as accusations, and Spinoza's answer to them is perhaps the most surprising part of all his philosophy, because from this seemingly cold and determined universe, he extracted a path to freedom and joy that continues to transform readers to this day. If everything that exists follows necessary laws, if you are a wave in the infinite ocean, moved by causes you did not choose, then it seems that little is left of you. Where is freedom? Spinoza's answer begins in the most uncomfortable way possible, by destroying the freedom you believe in to build one that truly works. Free will, he says, is an illusion. And the explanation is of surgical precision. Men consider themselves free because they are aware of their actions, but they ignore the causes that lead them to act. We feel that we choose, but we do not see the chain of causes behind each choice. Spinoza proposes an unforgettable image. Imagine a stone thrown through the air. Now imagine that in the middle of its flight, this stone gains consciousness. It would feel its own movement, feel the impulse to continue in that direction, and conclude proudly, "I am flying because I want to." The thinking stone would consider itself free. We, says Spinoza, are that stone. We feel desires, but we do not see what launched them. Stop and think about your life for a second. Did you choose the country where you were born, the language in which you think, the parents who raised you, the fears that were planted in you during childhood, the desires that appeared in you without asking for permission? Did you choose what you find beautiful, what makes you angry, what makes you want to cry? No. All of this happened to you, and it is about this mass of causes that you did not choose that you make your free decisions. Spinoza's honesty here is brutal, but notice, he is not insulting you. He is freeing you from a lie. Because while you believe that others act out of pure free will, you hate, blame, are indignant, resentful. And while you believe that your own failures are pure choices, you drown in guilt and shame. Hatred and guilt both depend on the same illusion. But then is everything lost? Are we puppets? No. And here begins the ascent. Because there is a huge difference, says Spinoza, between two states of human existence. He calls them servitude and freedom, and redefines both words. Servitude is being moved from the outside without understanding. It is the stone flying. It is reacting to every provocation, being dragged by every fear, every desire, every wave of anger or hope, without the slightest idea of where it comes from. Spinoza calls these states passions, from the Latin, that which is suffered, that which is endured. The man enslaved by passions, he writes, is like a ship without a rudder, tossed from side to side by winds he does not understand. And notice, this man can be rich, powerful, feared. He remains a slave. The tyrant who needs flattery, the envious one corroded by the success of others, the superstitious one terrified by divine punishments, all row chained in the same hold. Freedom, for Spinoza, is not the absence of causes. That does not exist for any being. Freedom is acting from one's own nature, guided by understanding. And the tool of this freedom is one, understanding. Here is the brilliant turning point of his psychology, which anticipated 300 years of discoveries in modern psychology. An emotion that is passively suffered transforms the moment we form a clear and distinct idea of it. In other words, the anger you do not understand governs you. The anger you comprehend, where it came from, what triggered it, what chain of causes produced it, loses its command over you. It does not disappear but changes nature. It ceases to be a wind that drags you and becomes a fact that you observe. Understanding is not a luxury for intellectuals. It is, literally, the mechanism of liberation. And Spinoza goes further, mapping the entire human emotional life from a single principle, which he calls conatus. Every being strives to persevere in its being. Everything that exists tends to continue existing and to expand its power. From this fundamental effort arise the two primary emotions around which everything revolves: joy, which is the feeling of our power increasing, when we understand, create, strengthen ourselves, connect, and sadness, which is the feeling of our power decreasing, when we are blocked, diminished, confused. And from this follows a revolutionary ethics, upside down in relation to everything that the religions of fear taught. The good is not what an external law commands. It is what genuinely increases our power to exist, act, and understand. The evil is what diminishes it. Joy, true joy, that of real power, not that of fleeting euphoria, is not suspect, is not sin, is not distraction from the sacred. It is the very sign of the right path. Spinoza is perhaps the only great philosopher who placed joy at the exact center of his system. And it is from here that his most devastating critique of the religion of fear arises, now no longer theological, but psychological. Superstition, he says, arises from sadness and fear. The man, terrified of the future, accepts any narrative that promises control, and there is always someone who profits from that fear. Governing by the fear of hell is to manufacture sad souls, and sad souls are easy to dominate. That is why tyrants of all kinds need you to be afraid. Sadness, for Spinoza, is neither humility nor virtue. It is the number one instrument of all dominations. And lucid joy, the power of those who understand, is the most subversive act that exists. But then if it is not the fear of punishment, what makes a man just, generous, honest? Spinoza's answer is elegantly disarming: understanding. Those who understand reality perceive that no man is an island, that nothing is more useful to man than another man guided by reason, that hatred weakens the hater, that envy is self-inflicted sadness, that helping others to flourish multiplies one's own power. Spinoza's wise man is not good because he fears divine punishment. He is good because he sees, because evil, seen clearly, is simply foolish, a wrong calculation about what strengthens us. Virtue does not need celestial vigilance, it needs lucidity. One last question remains, the biggest. Without heaven, without hell, without an immortal soul in the style of religious promises, What remains in the face of death? And what can salvation mean in such a universe? Spinoza had an answer for that too, an answer for which he saved the final pages of the Ethics, and which he wrote racing against the clock, because the glass dust was already finishing the job in his lungs. To understand the bomb that Spinoza was about to drop on Europe, you first need to see the board on which he was playing. The Netherlands of the 1660s was an ambulant paradox, the richest, most tolerant, and freest country on the continent, and, precisely because of that, a powder keg with a lit fuse. On one side, the Republicans led by Johann de Witt, the Grand Pensionary, a brilliant statesman who advocated commerce, peace, and religious tolerance. On the other, the House of Orange party, supported by the hardest Calvinist preachers, who dreamed of a strong prince in power, and the official religion dictating what could be thought and published. In the pulpits, inflamed pastors thundered against heretics, libertines, philosophers, and every crisis in the country was presented as divine punishment for excessive tolerance. Spinoza watched this tug-of-war with growing attention, and then something happened that transformed his concern into urgency. A man from his close circle, Adrian Courbat, committed the audacity that no one had committed before. He published radical ideas about religion not in Latin, the protected language of scholars, but in Dutch, the language of the people which any baker or sailor could read. He said things that echoed Spinoza's thought, that dogmas were inventions, that reason was the only reliable guide, that much of theology was fantasy serving power. The result was devastating. Courbat was hunted down, tried and condemned, thrown into a damp and brutal correction house. He fell ill within months. He died in 1669, at just over 30 years old. Spinoza understood the message, and responded to the message in the most Spinozist way possible. Instead of retreating, he attacked. If it was not safe to speak, he would speak with method, with strategy, with armor. He wrote in Latin, published anonymously, put a fake Hamburg publisher on the cover when the book came out of Amsterdam, and thus, in 1670, the book that would forever change the relationship of the West with its sacred texts arrived in the bookstores of Europe, like perfectly calculated contraband, the theological-political treatise. What was inside it? Something that no one had done before with that rigor. Spinoza took the Bible and read it as one reads any human document, without prior reverence, without commissioned conclusions. Who wrote this? When? In what language? For what audience? With what political intention? And the answers fell like hammer blows. The Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses, and he demonstrated, verse by verse, the anachronisms, the places named by names that would only exist centuries later. The death and burial of Moses himself, narrated in a book supposedly written by him. The sacred texts were late compilations, stitched together by scribes over generations, full of amendments, repetitions, and contradictions, human work, human history, human politics. And the prophets? Spinoza did not call them liars. He did something more subtle and more devastating. He called them men, men of powerful imagination and often admirable morality, who translated their ethical intuitions into the images, limits, and scientific errors of their time. Prophecy was not a channel of supernatural information, it was vivid imagination serving virtue. And the miracles? Here Spinoza was surgical. A miracle, by definition, would be God violating the laws of nature. But if the laws of nature are the very expression of divine nature, then a miracle would be God contradicting God, a logical absurdity. Accounts of miracles are records of events poorly understood by witnesses who did not know the natural causes. The less one understands, the more miracles one sees. But the deepest blow came later, the idea of the chosen people. Spinoza, the excommunicated Jew writing about the election of Israel, asserted that it did not mean any spiritual or metaphysical superiority. The ancient Hebrews were chosen only in the sense that they had, for a time, a prosperous state and well-adapted laws. Before nature, before God, all peoples are absolutely equal. God has no favorites, because God does not choose. Choosing is a human thing. And the true divine law, he said, fits in one line and needs no temple, to practice justice and charity. Everything else, rituals, hierarchies, ceremonies, is social organization dressed in eternity. And then, in the second half of the book, Spinoza turned the canon of theology toward politics and fired the thesis that would make him the secret patron of all future democracies. The state does not exist to impose truth, but to guarantee peace and security. And the true purpose of the republic is freedom. In a free republic, everyone must be able to think what they want and say what they think. Trying to govern minds is the mark of the tyrant, and it is, above all, useless. One can force a man to speak like a slave, but never to think like a slave. Prohibiting ideas does not produce faith, it produces hypocrites, and hypocrites, sooner or later, bring down any state. The reaction of Europe was a collective howl. In a few months, the treatise became the most attacked book of the century. A theologian defined it as a book forged in hell by a renegade Jew in partnership with the devil. Calvinist synods demanded its destruction. Catholics put it on the path to the index of forbidden books. Lutherans, Arminians, and Jews, people who disagreed on absolutely everything, finally found a common cause: to crush the anonymous author whose name, of course, all cultured Europe whispered. In 1674, the book was formally banned in the Netherlands, in the same wave as Hobbes's Leviathan. Selling it became a crime, possessing it a real risk. And yet, and this says everything about human nature, the book kept circulating, printed with false titles, bound as a medical treatise or collection of history, hidden in the bottoms of trunks and double shelves. The treatise crossed borders like precious contraband. All of Europe publicly condemned it and read it in secret by candlelight with the door locked. There was born a word that would function for 100 years as a destructive accusation of reputations: Spinozist. And there was also born, in silence, something greater: the perception, spread through thousands of minds, that it was possible to think the unthinkable. Spinoza watched the fire in his room in The Hague, where he had moved. He did not respond to the insults. He did not publish furious replies. He merely noted, in Letters to Friends, a melancholic observation: the fury of the theologians confirmed exactly what the book said about the power of fear. And he returned to work, because the treatise was just the clearing of the ground. The true construction, the book that would redefine God and man, continued to grow in the drawer. But before he could finish it, history would break down his door. And the most serene man in Europe, for the first and only time in his life, would lose control. The year 1672 has to this day a nickname in the history books of the Netherlands: Rampjaar, the year of disaster. And the name is not an exaggeration. That year, Louis XIV's France, the most powerful king in the world, invaded the Dutch Republic in alliance with England and 2 German principalities. The French army advanced almost without resistance. Cities fell one after another. There was panic in the streets, a run on the banks, people burying gold in their backyards. And the Dutch people, terrified, did what all terrified peoples have done since the beginning of time. They looked for a scapegoat. Radical preachers pointed fingers. The blame was Johann de Witt's, the Republican leader, the man of tolerance, the politician who protected free thinkers and allowed impious books to circulate. The war, they shouted from the pulpits, was God's punishment on a nation that tolerated heretics. And the crowd, which 20 years of prosperity had not taught to think, believed in 20 days of fear. On August 20th, 1672, Johann de Witt walked to the prison in The Hague to visit his brother Cornelis, incarcerated under a fabricated charge of conspiracy. Outside, a crowd gathered, sour with rumors and sermons. The civic militia, which should have contained the tumult, opened a path. What followed was one of the most shameful pages in European history. The De Witt brothers were dragged out, beaten, shot, and stabbed to death. Then, in a frenzy that chroniclers reported with nausea, the mob hung the bodies upside down on a gallows, mutilated them, and there were those who took pieces as trophies, and reports of those who sold and even ate them. This did not happen on a barbaric battlefield. It happened in the center of The Hague, the administrative capital of the most civilized country in Europe. a few minutes' walk from the house, where a lens polisher named Benedictus de Spinoza lived. And then we see something that no one, not even the closest friends, had ever seen: the man who had heard his eternal curse without shedding a tear, who had kept on the wall the coat pierced by the knife of a fanatic as one keeps a souvenir, who responded to the hatred of an entire continent with polite letters. This man broke down. Reports say that Spinoza cried convulsively upon learning of the massacre, and that, overwhelmed by an indignation that his entire philosophy taught him to tame, he wrote in large letters on a poster 2 words in Latin: Ultimi barbarorum, last of the barbarians, the bottom of the pit of barbarism. His intention was to go out that night and post the poster at the site of the lynching, before the city, before the mob. It would have been death. The same crowd that had torn apart the most powerful politician in the country would have minced in minutes the most famous heretic in Europe. And he would have gone. He just didn't, because his landlord, the painter Hendrik van der Spik, realized what was happening and locked the door of the house, refusing to hand over the key until that fever passed. Keep this scene dear, for it is worth 1,000 pages of commentary. For centuries, critics have accused Spinoza's philosophy of being cold, geometric, inhuman, a thinking machine without a heart. But there he is, the theorist of the mastery of passions, almost committing suicide out of indignation in the face of injustice. Spinoza was not a man without emotions. He was a man of violent emotions, who knew from personal experience, and not from theory, what they do to us. All his ethics arises from this intimate knowledge, to feel everything, to understand everything, and to refuse to become what one fights against. The poster he did not post is perhaps the most honest summary of his life. The year of disaster confirmed, point by point, the diagnosis of the treatise. Fear had transformed ordinary citizens into butchers. Superstition, stoked from pulpits, had destroyed in a single day decades of civilization. The Republic of Tolerance was agonizing. The party of the prince and the pastors was taking power. For Spinoza, the lesson was as clear as it was dark. As long as men are governed by fear of the future, of death, of divine punishment, there will always be those who harvest that fear and turn it into power. No frightened nation is free, no matter how free it proclaims itself in documents. And it was then, the following year, that fate decided to test the philosopher's coherence in an almost ironic way. In February 1673, a letter arrived in The Hague with a noble seal. The Palatine elector Karl Ludwig, through a professor from Heidelberg, offered Spinoza to the excommunicated, the cursed, the author of the book Forged in Hell, a chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg, one of the most prestigious in Europe. Salary, status, disciples, respectability, complete rehabilitation, served on a silver platter. With a single condition, written in the finest diplomatic language: the professor would have the broadest freedom to philosophize, as long as he did not use it to publicly disturb the established religion. Any other man of the century would have kissed the letter. Spinoza read the condition and saw in it, with those eyes trained to polish surfaces to total transparency, the cage within the gift. His response, brief and courteous, is one of the most admirable documents in the history of intellectual freedom. He deeply thanked the honor and declined. He gave 2 reasons. The first, teaching the youth would consume the time he needed to advance his own philosophy. The second, and here is the blade wrapped in velvet, he did not know how to say within which exact limits this freedom to philosophize should be contained, so as not to seem to disturb the established religion. Who would define the boundary? When would he discover that he had crossed it? Before or after dismissal, trial, imprisonment? Religious dissensions, he added, do not arise from zeal for faith, but from the ambition of men to dominate one another. Therefore, he preferred to remain as he was, a poor private individual, without title and without owner, than to accept the most glorious of positions with an invisible chain on his ankle. A renowned professor with a prince's salary, or a free artisan in a rented room. Spinoza chose the room, as he had chosen at 23, in the face of the pension offered by the synagogue, as he would always choose with a consistency that begins to seem supernatural until you understand that for him it was no sacrifice. No one finds it expensive to pay coins for what is worth more than all the coins. He returned to the lenses and to the manuscript. Time was urgent. The cough was worsening. His chest hurt. The glass dust was collecting its silent dews. And in the drawer, almost ready, awaited the answer to the only question that still mattered. If the God of fear does not exist, what exists in its place? It's time to open the drawer. It's time to enter the book for which Spinoza sacrificed everything, and to confront head-on the idea that made synagogues, churches, and thrones tremble. I'm going to ask you one thing in the next few minutes. Follow every step of the reasoning. Because the strength of this philosophy is not in any catchy phrase. It lies in the chain, in the feeling, terrifying for some and liberating for others, that each step compels the next. The book is called Ethics Demonstrated in the Manner of the Geometers, and the title is already a declaration of war. Spinoza writes about God, the human mind, and happiness, exactly as Euclid wrote about triangles and circles. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, each one closed with the initials QEDs, as it was to be demonstrated. No scripture citations, no appeal to tradition, no threat of punishment, no promise of reward, just reason, step by step. It's as if he says to the reader, don't believe me, verify. And to anyone who would want to bring him down, don't insult me, point out the error in the demonstration. 350 years later, opponents still insult more than they point. It all begins with the most fundamental question a mind can ask. What is needed for something to exist by itself? Spinoza calls substance that which exists in itself and is conceived by itself, which does not depend on anything else to be nor to be understood. Now look around. The chair depends on the wood on the tree on the soil, the rain, the sun on the laws of physics. Everything you know is dependent, supported by something else, a link in a chain. Climb the chain. What sustains everything without being sustained by anything? First demonstration, this substance must be infinite, because if it had a limit, something would limit it from the outside, and then it would depend on the relationship with that something, and it would not be substance. Second demonstration, there cannot be two. Do the mental test. If there were two infinite substances, where would one end for the other to begin? Each would be the boundary of the other. Neither would be infinite. Conclusion. Cold and inevitable as a theorem, there is one and only one substance. Absolutely infinite, eternal cause of itself, of which everything else is dependent. And to this unique and infinite reality, Spinoza gives the name it has always had in all languages, God. Up to this point, an unsuspecting theologian would applaud. It is now that the ground opens. Because Spinoza asks the question from which no traditional theology has ever escaped. If God is infinite, what exists outside of him? Think slowly. If the world exists outside of God, then God ends where the world begins. He has a boundary. He has a limit. He is not infinite. The only logical exit is dizzying. Nothing exists outside of God. Nothing. Neither matter, nor space, nor time, nor you. And if nothing exists outside of God, then the world was not created by God as a potter makes a vase, separate from him, observed from the outside, subject to please or disappoint. The world exists in God. It is the very divine reality in action. And Spinoza then writes the three Latin words for which he would be cursed for a century and quoted forever. Deus, sive, natura. God, that is, nature. Two names for the only thing that exists. However, beware of the easy shortcut. Spinoza is not saying that God is the stones and the trees, as in a naive postcard pantheism. He distinguishes precisely, there is nature naturing, the infinite and active power, the eternal laws, the inexhaustible source of everything, and nature natured, the set of produced things, galaxies, oceans, bodies, brains, thoughts. Each singular thing is what he calls a mode, a modification, an expression, a momentary way of being of the unique substance. The most faithful image is the one we have already used, the ocean and the waves. The wave is not created by the ocean as something external to it. The wave is the ocean undulating. It has a beginning, form, and end, and never, at any moment, was anything other than the sea itself. You, at this exact moment, listening to these words, a wave, a finite mode of the infinite substance, made of the same laws, of the same being, inseparable from the whole. And now the consequences come crashing down, and each one of them is a millennial pillar, turning to dust. If God is the infinite substance that acts by the necessity of its own laws, then God does not have will like a king. He does not deliberate, does not hesitate, does not change plans, does not repent. Everything follows from the divine nature with the same necessity with which it follows, from the nature of the triangle, that its angles sum to 180 degrees, and no one expects the triangle, on a generous day, to grant 200. God has no purposes. The idea that the universe exists for something is, says Spinoza, the oldest human prejudice. We act for ends, and we project onto the cosmos our psychology, imagining a great someone who also acts for ends, and who happens to care about us. God does not judge, does not punish, does not reward. Attributing anger, jealousy, or mercy to him is to fabricate a giant man and hang him in the sky. Spinoza distills this critique into an irony that has crossed the centuries. If triangles could speak, they would say that God is eminently triangular. God does not listen to prayers, not out of cruelty or deafness, but because he is not an employee on the other side of the cosmic counter. Asking reality to make an exception to its own laws is like asking that 2 + 2 by special mercy equals 5. And then, the final demolition, the one that hits each of us at the most intimate point. God did not create you. There was never a moment when a divine will decided that you should exist, lovingly designed your face, and sent you into the world with a personalized mission. You are not a special project of a celestial craftsman. You are a necessary expression of the infinite nature, just like every star, every ant, every thought that crosses a mind. It is here that most readers throughout the centuries close the book in anger, feeling robbed of something precious. But those who take a deep breath and continue discover what Spinoza put in its place. Because notice what just happened, pay close attention. If you were not created by God, it is because you were never separate from God. Creation requires distance, the creator on one side, the creature on the other, and between the two an abyss that prayers, rituals, and merit try to cross their whole lives. Spinoza eliminates the abyss. There is no crossing, because there is no opposite shore. You are not the work of the infinite. You are part of the infinite. What religions promised as the final prize for a few chosen ones, union with God, ethics demonstrates as a present, permanent, and universal fact. It does not need to be earned. It cannot be lost. It has never been different. The god of fear dies in these pages, it's true, and Spinoza does not apologize. But see what dies alongside. Hell, original sin, cosmic guilt, eternal vigilance, the terror of judgment. And see what is born. An infinite intelligible universe, of which you are a direct expression, without intermediaries, without sacred agents, with no one between you and the absolute. Only this opens a gigantic problem, and Spinoza knew better than anyone. If everything follows from necessary laws, if even your thoughts are links in a chain of causes, what is left of human freedom? If God does not judge, why be good? If there is no heaven or hell, what remains of morality, of meaning, of hope in the face of death? Europe shouted these questions against him as if throwing stones. And the answer he built is perhaps the most surprising part of the entire system, because from this seemingly cold and determined universe, Spinoza extracted a path to freedom and joy that continues to transform lives to this day. If everything that exists follows necessary laws, if you are a wave moved by currents you did not choose, then it seems that very little is left of you. Where is freedom? Spinoza's answer begins in the most uncomfortable way possible, demolishing the freedom you believe in, to build in its place one that truly works. Free will, he says, is an illusion, and the explanation fits in a sentence of surgical precision. Men think they are free because they are aware of their desires, but they ignore the causes that produce them. We feel that we choose. What we do not see is the chain of causes behind each choice. To engrave this forever, Spinoza offers one of the most powerful images in the history of philosophy. Imagine a stone thrown through the air. Now imagine that, in mid-flight, this stone gains consciousness. It would feel its own movement, feel the impulse to continue on that trajectory, and would conclude with total sincerity, "I am flying because I want to. I chose this direction." The thinking stone would see itself as free for the simple reason that it feels the flight and does not see the throw. We, says Spinoza, are that stone. Test it in your own life. Did you choose the country where you were born? The language in which your thoughts happen? The parents who shaped you? The fears they planted in you before you could defend yourself? The desires that sprout without asking for permission? Did you choose what you find beautiful? Did you choose what you feel nostalgia for? No. All of this happened to you. And it is on top of this mountain of unchosen causes that we make our free decisions. The honesty here is brutal, but notice what it liberates. While you believe that others act out of pure free will, you hate, blame, resent. He did it because he wanted to, he could have not done it. And while you believe that your failures are pure choices, you drown in guilt and shame. The hatred of others and the hatred of oneself both drink from the same source, the illusion of free will. Understanding the causes is not to excuse everything. It is to exchange the court for understanding, which is the only place from which any real change has ever come. But then are we puppets and that's it? No. And here begins the ascent, the part of the system where Spinoza stops demolishing and starts building. Because there is, he says, an abyssal difference between two states of human life, and he names them with two words that he completely redefines: servitude and freedom. Servitude is being moved from the outside, without understanding. It is the stone in mid-flight, convinced of its own choices. It is reacting to every provocation, being dragged by every fear, every desire, every tide of anger, hope or panic, without the slightest idea of where these forces come from. Spinoza calls these states passions, from Latin, that which is suffered, that which is passively endured. The man dominated by passions, he writes, is like a ship without a rudder, tossed by contrary winds, agitated like the sea in a storm, ignorant of its own destiny. And pay attention, this man can be rich, famous, feared. He remains a servant. The tyrant who depends on flattery like a drug, the envious corroded by others' brilliance, the superstitious terrified by plagues and punishments, all row in the same hold, chained to forces they do not understand. Freedom, for Spinoza, is not the absence of causes. That does not exist for any being in the universe. Freedom is acting from one's own nature, guided by understanding. Free is not the one who escapes the causal chain, it is the one who understands it. And understanding ceases to be a plaything of it to become an agent within it. And the tool of this passage has a single name: knowledge. Here is the brilliant turning point of Spinoza's psychology, which anticipated by 3 centuries what modern psychology would rediscover in offices and laboratories. An emotion that is a passion ceases to be a passion the moment we form a clear and distinct idea of it. Translated, the anger you do not understand governs you. The anger you comprehend, what triggered it, what old wound it feeds on, what chain of causes brought it here, loses the throne. It does not disappear, it changes nature. It ceases to be the wind that drags the ship and becomes a datum on the navigator's map. Understanding is not a luxury for intellectuals. It is literally the mechanism of liberation. And on what material does this mechanism work? Spinoza maps the entire emotional life from a single principle, which he calls conatus. Every being strives to persevere in its being. Everything that exists tends to continue existing and to expand its power to act, from the plant that twists toward the light to the man who builds, loves, and learns. From this fundamental effort derive the 2 primary emotions that command all others. Joy, which is what we feel when our power to exist and act increases, when we understand something, create, strengthen ourselves, find those who expand us, and sadness, which is the feeling of power diminishing, when we are blocked, humiliated, confused, belittled. Love, for Spinoza, is simply joy, accompanied by the idea of its cause. Hate, sadness, accompanied by the idea of its cause. With these pieces, he constructs the complete engineering of human emotions: envy, jealousy, hope, fear, pride, remorse, like a watchmaker disassembling a clock. And from this arises an upside-down ethics in relation to everything that the religions of fear have taught. The good is not what an external law commands under threat. It is what genuinely increases our power to exist, act, and understand. The evil is what diminishes it. And joy, real joy, that of growing power, not the euphoria of a night, is not sin, is not suspicion, is not worldly distraction from the sacred. It is the very sign that we are on the right path. Spinoza is perhaps the only one among the great philosophers to place joy at the geometric center of his system. No deity, he wrote, no being that is not envious, can take pleasure in my impotence and my suffering, nor consider virtue our tears and our fear. And it is from here that his most devastating accusation against the organized religion of his time emerges, now no longer theological, but psychological. Superstition arises from sadness and fear. The man, terrified of the future, accepts any narrative that promises control, and there has never been a shortage of those who profited from this fear. To govern by the terror of hell is to manufacture sad souls, and sad souls are docile, obedient, easy to lead. Therefore, every type of tyrannical power, from pulpit or throne, needs you to be afraid, needs you to feel small, guilty, indebted. Sadness, concludes Spinoza, is neither humility nor virtue. It is the number one instrument of all domination. And lucid joy, the serene power of one who understands, is the most subversive act a human being can commit. But then, if it is not the fear of punishment that sustains morality, why be just, generous, honest? Spinoza's answer disarms with elegance, for the same reason that someone who understands numbers does not make a mistake on purpose. Those who comprehend reality realize that nothing is more useful to man than another man guided by reason, that hatred weakens first the one who hates, that envy is a self-inflicted sadness in the face of another's joy, that helping others to flourish multiplies the power of all, including our own. The wise person of Spinoza is not good because a celestial camera watches over him. He is good because he sees, because malice, examined clearly, is always a miscalculation about what truly strengthens us. Virtue does not need divine surveillance. It needs lucidity. And hatred, he wrote, is never overcome by reciprocal hatred. Only love and generosity overcome it, because only they do not feed it. There remained one last question, the greatest of all, the one that lurks in every human being in the silence of the night. Without a promised heaven, without a threatened hell, without the immortal soul of religious promises, what remains in the face of death? Can there be salvation in such a universe? And what would it be made of? Spinoza saved the answer for the final pages of Ethics, and he wrote them rushing against the clock, because the glass dust, after 20 years of silent work, was finishing the job in his lungs. Death was never abstract for Spinoza. He knew it by name, by date, by hands, his mother when he was a child, his father in adolescence, friends along the way. And now, at 43, with his body beginning to refuse, with the cough growing deeper and his lungs becoming more fragile, death hovered over him not as an idea to discuss, but as an imminent fact. While writing the last pages of Ethics, Spinoza was not theoretically concerned with mortality. He was personally settling accounts with it. And it is precisely for this reason that what he wrote in those final pages is so radical, because it is not speculation from a man who still believes he has decades ahead. It is the conclusion of someone who already sees the door of the room on the other side. Most religions offer the same package in the face of death. You die, but your soul, the real essence of you, survives. It goes to a place, heaven, paradise, reincarnation, and one way or another you continue to exist. It is comfortable. It is also, says Spinoza, false. because the soul, as defined by religions, an immaterial, incorporeal entity, separable from the body, does not exist. What exists is the mind, the idea of the body, the knowledge that the body has of itself. And when the body dies, the mind dies with it. There is no soul that floats to heaven. There is no consciousness after death. You end. It seems devastating. And for those still trapped in the illusion of free will and the superstition of divine judgment, it is. But Spinoza had something more to say. And it is here that his philosophy ceases to be thought and becomes an experience you can live now at this moment. Because there exists, and he demonstrates it with precision, a part of us that is eternal. Not the person you believe you are, with your name and your story, but understanding, the comprehension, the ideas you form about things. These ideas participate while they exist in you in the eternity of God. A mathematician who discovers a truth, that 2 + 2 = 4, that the Pythagorean theorem holds, this truth once understood is eternal. It does not die when the mathematician dies, it remains true, it continues to exist, and while the mathematician was understanding, he participated in that eternity. That moment of understanding was on one side temporal, it happened in a moment, on the other side it was eternal. What he understood was the truth that has always been and always will be. Spinoza calls this blessedness, beatitude, bliss, and it is not a reward for having been good. It is a direct consequence of understanding. The more you understand reality, not the opinions about it, but reality itself, the causes, the connections, the logic of the universe, the more your mind expands toward the infinite, the more you participate in that eternity. It is as if you, by thinking clearly, cease to be a separate wave and become aware that you have always been the ocean. That feeling you sometimes have when you learn something true, when you understand a pattern, when you see how the pieces fit together, that feeling of clarity, of peace, of belonging, that is eternal. That is beatitude. That is salvation. And notice, you do not need to die to experience it. It starts now. With every truth you understand, you gain a fragment of eternity. Death, when it comes, takes nothing you have truly gained, because what you genuinely understood remains true. What you truly loved continues to have been loved. What you genuinely created continues to exist in reality. You are mortal in time, but immortal in your works, in your understandings, in your contribution to the intelligence of the universe. It is not heaven, but it is something, and it is true. This idea, this particular way of facing death, was so radical, so different from the promises of personal immortality of religions, that for centuries critics simply ignored it, as if pretending not to hear a blasphemy. But there is something in it that has crossed generations, a way of thinking that allows the atheist to die in peace and the religious to disbelieve without despair. If you understood well, your understanding is eternal. If you loved well, your love remains. If you created well, your creation is. Death is just the end of form, not of content. Now, I would like to hear you at this point, because while you were here following this life, this mind, this work, you thought of something, perhaps of someone you love, perhaps of an idea you would like to leave behind, perhaps of how you would like to be remembered. What passed through your mind just now, this reflection that Spinoza awakened, is exactly what he was talking about, that feeling of eternity that touches you when you think about what really matters. Write in the comments, what is the truth, the idea, or the love that you would like to be eternal? What is the understanding you already have now and do not want to lose when life ends? Be honest, because this is the conversation Spinoza invites you to have. And while you think about that, let me tell you something. Only those who deeply understand their own mortality can live with this clarity. Only those who have accepted that they will die can truly live. And that is why Spinoza's philosophy, which begins by destroying the comfort of illusions, ends up offering something that no religion offers, real peace, here, now, without waiting for a future life that may never come. If this way of thinking resonates with you, if there is a part of you that feels it is possible to live this way, then you are perhaps the kind of person who should be on this channel. Because this is where we bring the ideas that transform, the lives that change the course of history, the questions that no one dares to ask out loud. Subscribe now, and let's discover together what truths you want to leave as an eternal legacy. Because what comes next in this story? Well, let's just say Spinoza still had more to say, and he didn't have much time to say it. Ethics was ready in 1675. Spinoza did not publish it. He knew that no publisher would accept it without a death sentence hanging over his head. The book remained in the drawer of his room while he made handwritten copies in Latin for a few trusted friends. It circulated as a manuscript, from hand to hand, among a secret network of people who understood they were touching something forbidden. A Frenchman named Leibniz, who would become one of the greatest philosophers of the century, contacted Spinoza just to obtain a copy of the manuscript, and then, cautiously, began to steal from it. He took ideas, reformulated them, published them safely, always making it clear that he disagreed with Spinoza, of course, but there was something interesting there. Meanwhile, Spinoza continued polishing lenses and answering letters. His correspondence from that time reveals a man under pressure and aware of it. He received letters from people accusing him of atheism, of destroying faith, of corrupting youth. He also received letters from people who read him in secret and wrote saying that, for the first time in their lives, they found meaning in the universe. Spinoza replied to everyone in the same tone, polite, never condescending, never inflamed. When someone accused him of denying God, he corrected them. "You do not understand, I do not deny God. I only deny your God, the one who depends on your prayers, who needs your supplications, who gets irritated by human laughter." In 1676, a special visitor arrived in The Hague. It was the German philosopher Leibniz, who wanted to meet Spinoza in person. The two men met in secret because Leibniz, despite his intellectual admiration, could not afford to be seen as a friend of the damned. For days they talked about God, about nature, about philosophy. Leibniz tried, in subtle ways, to convince Spinoza to publish his work, to gain visibility, to defend himself against the accusations. Spinoza calmly refused. Why? The people who could understand would understand. The others, no amount of explanations would make them comprehend. It was a serenity that impressed or frightened, depending on who was watching. Because Spinoza knew he was dying. The cough was worsening. He was becoming more fragile each day. And he did nothing beyond what he was already doing. Working, thinking, answering letters. Without haste, without despair. Like someone who has already done what they came to do. In early 1677, his body began to fail for real. Tuberculosis. The same one that had killed his mother. Spinoza knew it. The doctors, pessimistic, knew it. And Spinoza continued working as far as he could, dictating answers when his hands did not obey. In February, his condition worsened drastically. He got out of bed a few times. His landlords, deeply disturbed, tried to convince him to call a priest. Perhaps they said in the end there might be some comfort that religion could offer. Spinoza calmly refused. He had not changed his mind. He had not discovered, in the face of death, that he was wrong. Clarity until the end. On February 21st, 1677, a Sunday, Spinoza died. The owner of the house was at church. It was Sunday, Mass time. The other occupants did not hear when he left, a room from the building next door, 4 steps away, and expired. When they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The lens polisher had departed. The man who had dedicated his life to teaching humanity to see clearly was, finally, blind. There was no will. There were no heirs waiting for a fortune. What he left were some coins, a few worn clothes, many polished lenses, and a manuscript in perfect Latin, which his friends immediately began to hide, fearing it would be destroyed, because everyone knew that was dynamite. And the detonation would only begin after he was no longer there to defend himself. The news of his death circulated quickly among the Dutch intellectuals, and the reaction was revealing. Some felt relief. A danger had been removed. Others felt a peculiar loss. The man who had never published a book in life had been already dead, more influential than any of his eminences. Some letters that arrived after his death express, in careful lines, a kind of admiring respect, even though their writers could not admit it publicly. What no one knew at that moment was that Spinoza's death was just the beginning of his life. Because a forbidden book, a manuscript circulating in secret, has a magical property. It grows. Each handwritten copy multiplies the danger, and therefore the importance. Each prohibition makes it more desired. Each refutation by theologians makes it more provocative. While Spinoza lived, he had to be careful, he had to avoid imprisonment. Dead, he could be completely radical, and he was. In 1677, the same year of his death, a complete edition of his works was published in Amsterdam anonymously with false printing data. It was the Ethics, and around it like satellites came the theological-political treatises, letters, scattered thoughts. Everything he had hidden under pseudonyms, everything that had circulated only among friends, was now loose in the world. The reaction was instant and furious. Priests and pastors proclaimed the book the most dangerous in history. Philosophers began to cite it to refute it, which, of course, meant they needed to explain its ideas, and by explaining they propagated. In newspapers, there were analyses recommending its destruction. In the secret salons of courts, there was furtive reading. In just one generation, Spinoza went from a man living in the shadows to the most discussed heretic in Europe. And here began something that may be the best revenge a philosopher can have. His ideas began to appear in places he could never have imagined. A theologian read refuted, and in refuting, a spark of understanding remained. A scientist read, disagreed, but a new question arose from the disagreement. A priest who knew his philosophy only second-hand began to question his certainties, because that dead man was right on certain points. The slow inoculation. 350 years later, when asked by Albert Einstein what his concept of God was, he replied with two words, Spinoza's God, the God of Spinoza. It was not a God who performed miracles, who answered prayers, who chose favorites. It was the ordering intelligence of nature, the perfect law, the harmony of the universe revealed. And when asked if he believed in a sacred book, Einstein replied, "My sacred book is Euclid," or perhaps he should have said, "It is Spinoza," because it was a geometric, necessary philosophy, demonstrated step by step. And it was not just Einstein. Goethe read him and revered him. Hegel built his philosophy dialoguing with him, agreeing here, refuting there, but always starting from Spinoza. Marx took the idea of historical necessity almost directly from Spinoza. Freud, developing the theory of the unconscious, was, without always recognizing it, exploring the same ground where Spinoza had mapped the passions. Even Darwin, when describing how organisms evolve through natural selection, without planning, without purpose beyond their own perpetuation, was confirming what Spinoza had said about a universe without ultimate ends. Modern science, when it arrived, astonishingly confirmed most of Spinoza's intuitions. Is the universe deterministic? Yes, classical physics suggested so. Does God have will and plans? No. Nature acts only according to laws. Is there traditional free will? It seems not. But there is understanding. And understanding liberates. Is the soul immortal? No. But true ideas, genuine creations, real loves remain. Is death total destruction? Not entirely. That part of you that participated in eternity remains true. When ethics resurfaced in the late 18th and during the 19th century, there was no longer an inquisition with the power to burn books. There was, however, something more insidious. There was strategic silence. Most European philosophers treated Spinoza as if he did not exist, or cited him so obliquely that it was like an invisibility guaranteed by respect itself. It was safer to deny that the man was important than to acknowledge and have to refute him. Because refuting Spinoza meant confronting the very structure of one's own beliefs. But there were exceptions, and one of the most important came through a movement that Spinoza did not live to see. The German Spinozismus of the early 19th century, especially through thinkers like Schelling and Hegel. Suddenly, There were first-order philosophers for whom Spinoza was not a heretic to be destroyed, but a thinker to be surpassed, which means something quite different. It means that his work had been digested enough to generate new thoughts from it. Hegel, specifically, committed a dangerous honesty. He said that whoever is not a Spinozist is not a philosopher, and although he disagreed with several points of Spinoza's philosophy, especially about the dynamic nature of thought and history, he made it clear that no philosophy that did not take Spinoza into account could call itself such. It was a masked acknowledgement of importance. But the price of all this, the growing importance, the expanding influence, was strange. As more people read Spinoza, the Church could do less about it, because he was dead, because his ideas had already overflowed the confines of any censorship, and because with the advent of modern science and liberal democracy, it became increasingly difficult to explain why that man from the 17th century continued to be a threat. Then came a more subtle strategy. If they could not destroy Spinoza, they could deform him. They could make him something domesticated without the edges, and for a long time, and still today in conservative circles, that worked. Spinoza became a romantic pantheist, a man who loved nature in a mystical way. He became a poetic writer, too much to be taken seriously as a scientist. He became a useless metaphysician when modernity was empirical. Each generation of academics found a way to put him in a drawer. But the truth resists. And the truth about Spinoza is that he was perhaps the first completely modern thinker, the first to separate reality from any comfortable narrative about it. He did this at a time when it would lead him to death, and he did it in such a way that, centuries later, when science finally reached the viewpoint from which he started, it discovered that the path had already been mapped. Because notice what Spinoza had said and demonstrated. Reality follows necessary laws. Nothing happens without a cause. The universe was not made for us. We are not the center. We are not special in a cosmic way. We have bodies like every animal. We have minds that emerge in those bodies. We have passions that are driven by causes we do not choose. And yet, still, we can understand. And understanding is to free ourselves. This truth, this particular way of seeing reality, is exactly what modern science has concluded, and continues to do so today. The Big Bang was not creation by divine will, it was the consequence of the laws of physics. Life was not designed, it emerged from chemical processes and natural selection. You do not have an immortal soul. You have a thinking brain, and when it stops, you stop. None of this was planned. None of this has cosmic purpose. And yet you can know the truth, you can understand how it works, you can genuinely love. You can create things that remain. You can live with real joy, not the deceptive hope of heaven, but the present satisfaction of blooming potential. This is Spinoza, not as a dead philosophy in a dead book, but as a living description of the universe in which you truly live. There is a final detail of Spinoza's life that no one comments on, but which summarizes everything. When he died, his landlord, the painter Hendrik van der Spik, an Orthodox Catholic who had locked Spinoza in the house during the year of disaster to spare him from the crowd, began to anxiously search for any family document that would publicly associate him with the damned philosopher, not because he wanted to destroy the work, but because he wanted to protect his own reputation. But one aspect of what the landlord did is touching. He did not destroy Spinoza's papers. He kept them. He waited. And when he saw that there were people who valued that work, he allowed it to circulate. There was in him some silent understanding that that man who had been a tenant was someone of importance, someone who, accused of everything, condemned of everything, destroyed of everything, had remained simply right. The lives of two men converge here in a detail that historians often overlook. In 1761, 84 years after Spinoza's death, a boy was born in Germany, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He would grow up to be the greatest writer of his time, the man who redefined European literature. But Goethe committed a boldness that no one of his stature allowed themselves. He publicly admired Spinoza. He wrote that reading Spinoza had transformed his view of himself and the world. And more importantly, he became one of the few great intellectuals to acknowledge, without beating around the bush, that there was no fear in his admiration. Goethe read the Ethics as one drinks water after weeks in the desert, and what he drank was exactly this: the permission to understand the world without needing to redirect it, to conform to the expectations of faith. Goethe was an artist, and Spinoza's Ethics, his insistence on joy as a sign of the right, his understanding of emotions as natural and not sinful expressions, provided theoretical support for everything Goethe felt intuitively as a poet. But the most fascinating thing is that Goethe did not become a violent or militant atheist. He simply became understanding. He saw nature with new eyes. He saw men with compassion, understanding that they were driven by causes they did not choose, and that for this reason they deserved understanding before condemnation. He saw the universe as an intelligible whole, without the need for divine supervision, but also without a void of meaning. And he wrote about all this in ways that continue to touch the human heart. There was, in Goethe, a living demonstration of something Spinoza had theorized, that you can live without fear of hell and still be a deep, sensitive, creative, and morally serious person, that you can accept that the universe was not made for you and still find joy, beauty, and purpose. That understanding does not destroy the soul, it redeems it. But while Goethe represented the intellectual acceptance of Spinoza, there was at the same time a very lively rejection still ongoing. The Church had not abandoned the fight against the ideas he represented. It had only changed tactics. Instead of burning books and condemning people, now the strategy was more sophisticated: to disfigure, trivialize, partially absorb, while rejecting the essential. Yes, Spinoza was right about some details, said the conciliatory theologians. But he was wrong about the big picture, because even if the soul is not immortal in the way we imagined, there is still a divine spark that makes us special. Even if God does not intervene directly in miracles, there is still a hidden purpose guiding history. Small concessions that preserve the essence of the illusion. Spinoza had killed the specific God of religions, the one who chooses, who judges, who loves his own and hates the infidels. But even after dying, he had to deal with attempts to resurrect a softened version of that same God, and it is here that you see the strength of his logic. When you demonstrate something, truly demonstrate, with impeccable arguments, those who wish to refute must do the same. They cannot just appeal to authority or tradition, they must find the error in the demonstration. And no one has ever found it. What they began to do then was more trivial. Ignore, describe him in such a tedious way that no one would want to read anymore, slowly tarnish his reputation through rumors and half-truths. It worked for a time. But again, truths have an uncomfortable resistance. They echo in unexpected ways. Let us take the case of Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimistic philosopher of the 19th century, who, for obvious reasons, hated Spinoza. Schopenhauer dedicated pages and pages to refuting Spinoza, because secretly he had absorbed much from him. The idea that the universe is a manifestation of a single force, which Schopenhauer called will, where Spinoza had called substance, came directly from Spinoza. Schopenhauer's pessimism was, in a sense, Spinoza, for someone who had woken up in a bad mood and realized that the power he spoke of could also be purposeless suffering. And then came Friedrich Nietzsche, who read Schopenhauer, and through Schopenhauer indirectly absorbed Spinoza. Nietzsche hated the Christianity that Spinoza had logically criticized with arguments. Nietzsche hated it viscerally, with all his passion. And yet the structure of thought, the idea that life is above all a will to power, that values do not fall from the sky but are created by men, that clarity about reality is what liberates. All of this was Spinoza repackaged in a more brutal and provocative language. What no one expected was that, once Spinoza was freed from theological masking, once his ideas circulated openly in the air of modernity, they would repeatedly prove to be true. Quantum physics would confirm his determinism, while paradoxically also proving to be stranger than anything. Psychology would confirm his mapping of emotions. Neuroscience would confirm that the mind emerges from the body. History would confirm that empires and religions are built on the manipulation of fear. It was all there, in 1675, in a geometric ethics. Spinoza had seen so clearly that, even when formal science caught up with him, It could not add much, only confirm that yes, that man was right. Let's go back a bit, because there is an aspect of Spinoza's life that is often overlooked, but which is central to understanding why his philosophy remains so alive, and why it continues to scare. It is this. Spinoza was an extremely attentive man to the political circumstances of his time. He was not a thinker living in an ivory tower, abstracted from realities. He was attentive to every movement of power, every coercion, every form of domination he observed. And his philosophy was not an intellectual luxury. It was a weapon of combat. When Spinoza said that the state should not control minds, that freedom of thought is the foundation of any real republic, that religion used by power is always superstition, he was not making a historical analysis. He was describing the world in which he lived, where he had seen friends imprisoned, where he had seen politicians lynched in squares, where he had seen superstition used to mobilize murderous crowds. His philosophy had urgency, because it was a diagnosis and remedy for a disease he saw with his own eyes. And that is why it remains urgent. Because the forms of domination, while the names change, continue to be essentially the same. You do not need a medieval Inquisition or a Catholic Church with state power to see functioning today exactly what Spinoza described. Just observe how fear is systematically administered, how narratives of existential threat are constructed, how a frightened population is a docile population, how those who control the interpretation of events control the population, how modern superstition, the fear of the future, the belief in conspirators, the search for scapegoats for chaos, works exactly like the old ones, just with different names. Spinoza saw that there are exactly two ways to govern. The first is through fear. You convince people that they are in danger, that they need protection, that they must obey. The second is through understanding. You offer people tools to understand reality and trust that by understanding, they will make rational decisions. Most governments throughout history have chosen the first route. It is easier, faster, more predictable. Spinoza pointed out the price. A population of human beings living in a state of agitation, unable to understand their own lives, always anxious, always controlled. The second path, of real freedom, of real understanding, of real education, is slower. It works only with people willing to think, but it produces real human beings, not herds with consciousness. Spinoza chose to live as if it were possible to live this way, alone, without protection from any institution, thinking clearly. And when his body failed, he had left behind a guide, how to continue this way after his death through his work. There is a letter that Spinoza wrote to a correspondent where he addresses precisely this theme, how to live as a free man in a society that conspires to keep you enslaved. And his answer is disarming. Freedom is a practice, not a condition. You do not achieve it once and keep it forever. It is something you do every day, every time you choose to understand instead of react, to know instead of believe, to question instead of accept. Every time you feel anger, and instead of acting on impulse, you ask yourself what source that anger comes from. Every time you feel fear, and instead of succumbing to panic, you try to understand what generates that fear. Is it a harder life? Yes. Does it require more effort? Absolutely. Does it offer more comfort than passive belief? No, it will never offer that, but it offers something more valuable. The chance to be truly human, to live from yourself, not as a reflection of others' demands, to exercise your unique, irreplaceable potential, that which no other mind can do exactly your way. This, for Spinoza, was everything. It was for what he worked with the lenses. It was for what he refused the positions. It was for what he died poor and despised, because he had chosen repeatedly the freedom of understanding over the security of obedience. And that is why he remains relevant. It is not because his ethics is a perfect system. It has flaws, it has gaps. It is because he diagnosed the fundamental structure of power and liberation and offered a path that you can follow right now in your life. Without waiting for revolution or divine redemption, you can start today. Less reaction, more understanding. Less fear, more clarity. less obedience to narratives you did not choose, more honest questioning of reality. This is Spinoza lived. This is his legacy. There is one last thing to say, and it is about the immortality that Spinoza believed existed, but not the one that religions preach. It is about how a man who died at 44, who never published a book under his own name, who never held an important position, who was never recognized by the powerful, how this man continues today, more alive than most of his contemporaries who died at the height of fame. If you enter a theoretical physics laboratory today, you will see that the assumptions under which they work come straight from Spinoza. The universe is deterministic, governed by laws, has no cosmic intentionality, and there is no supernatural observer. If you enter a psychoanalyst's office with honest orientation, you will see that the tools for understanding emotions used there are born from Spinoza, understanding one's own impulses, seeing them not as manifestations of the devil or of a perverted character, but as comprehensible expressions of causes. If you open any treatise on contemporary secular ethics, that ethics which does not appeal to God to justify why we should be good, you will find Spinoza as a constant reference. But it is not just that. There is something more subtle. There is a certain type of person who in every age discovers Spinoza and finds there for the first time permission to question, permission to reject inherited certainties, permission to be happy without guilt, permission to accept death without despair, permission to live as one who thinks, not as one who obeys. Some of the greatest thinkers of the last 300 years have gone through this experience. Borges, the Argentine writer, wrote, "Perhaps the Spinozist and mystical revelation, this way of feeling that God and the universe are one and the same reality, is the highest form of religion." And not because Borges was an atheist, it was because the way Spinoza thought of God as infinite activity, as pure power, as that which expresses itself in every act and every thought, resonated more deeply than all dogmatic theology. The historian Rebecca Goldstein wrote a recent biography of Spinoza, where she presents a portrait of a man who is almost disturbing in his serenity, a man for whom understanding was genuinely everything, so totalizing that death itself seemed a minor event. She writes about how, for Spinoza, the whole of life was an exercise in a single thing, expanding understanding. Each polished lens was an opportunity to understand optics. Each answered letter was understanding offered. Each page of philosophy written was the attempt to describe the very structure of reality, not to gain fame, but because understanding was truly living. And here we reach the point where the biography becomes irrelevant, because the historical Spinoza, the man who lived in rented rooms and died of tuberculosis, is important only as he opens the door to the timeless Spinoza, the thinker whose ideas have the quality of remaining true regardless of when you encounter them. In 1680, reading him was dangerous. In 1780, it was scandalous. In 1880, it was intellectually important. In 1980, it was classic. In 2020, it is essential. And why? Because he touched on something that does not age, the structure of reality and the path to freedom within it. You live in a time when, technically, you have more access to information than any human being in history, and yet, and perhaps because of that, you also live in a time where fear is systematically cultivated, where superstition reappears under new names, where crowds can be mobilized from panic. We live in a world that Spinoza would immediately recognize as governed by fear, even if the names of the threats are different. So perhaps Spinoza's greatest legacy is this, that it is possible to escape. Not through faith. He proved that faith, when based on fear, is merely slavery, but through understanding, by refusing to accept any interpretation of reality simply because it comes from those in power, by asking the simplest and most dangerous questions. Why? How do you know? Where does this come from? What is the real cause? That was the work of the life of Benedict de Spinoza. That is what you have in hand when you open that strange geometric book, with no concessions to comfort, an offering from someone who died to protect it, a tool for liberation, An invitation to live understanding, and now you know where it came from.